Hi again, this is Andrew Gibbons. Welcome to day 2 of the Body of Knowledge course. So on day 1, we did this particular lesson that was basically simple bending to the side. You had your arm up on top of your head and you were learning how to tilt the head, so to speak, but really it was about how you distributed the movement through the spine, how you included the movement of the pelvis with the movement of the head, and we did it in the other direction as well. And if you'll remember, one of the important principles that we looked at was how do you sense your own ability to actually lengthen your spine as you begin the movement, rather than compressing, squeezing the distance between the bottom and the top. Yeah? So we're going to continue with this theme, only we're going to do it in a different plane of movement. So the first day we did it in this plane called the coronal plane. And for the second lesson we're going to do something very similar, but in the sagittal plane. That's the plane that divides us left and right. Sagittal plane sits here, coronal plane sits there, horizontal plane parallel to the floor. So now, this time, place your hands gently on your knees and simply begin to lower your head. Now, as the head lowers down, there's going to be some movement in your spine, somewhere in your spine. Now, some people actually struggle with this, and when they lower the head, the movement only exists at a very high place up in the neck. When they lower the head, there may not be a big response through the rest of the spine. And that's fine, but just take a few movements to notice what your particular tendency is without trying to change it. Yeah? And then the question you can ask, which is, does my pelvis, is there any sensations in the pelvis that indicate that my head is moving? Now, if the pelvis doesn't move, the sensation you experience might just be one of tension in the back of the neck or somewhere in the back or in the torso. But what if you did the movement where you slowly lowered your head and you began to actually roll the pelvis a little bit backwards underneath you, so that the movement of the head now, instead of being a short, limited arc like this, starts to take on a slightly larger arc through space. Yeah? And in the beginning, the best thing to do is to simply alternate. Deliberately prevent your pelvis from moving and lower the head in the safest way you can. And simply notice where the tension appears in your back. After you make a few movements like this, pause, and now take away whatever effort you were using to keep the pelvis still, and now begin to lower the head by rolling the pelvis back at the same time. Again, there's really no amount of movement, there's no quantity that you're trying to achieve. You're just looking to connect the sensations of the bottom and the top moving together. And the other thing you may want to attune your senses to is whether or not your eyes are free to sort of scan down the wall in front of you as the head lowers. This is very important. A lot of people, when they listen to instructions or they're in a class and they hear begin lowering the head, they may lower the head, but as they concentrate, they tend to fix the eyes. Fixing the eyes on a point in space sometimes is part of the way a person concentrates, but that's not necessary here. You simply let the eyes scan slowly down so that they're part of the pattern. Yeah. Now there's another detail here to begin to think about, and that's that when the head starts to bend forward and you start to create this rounding quality through the spine, can you see how the middle of the back here actually has to move slightly in the opposite direction that the head does. And that if the middle of the back doesn't move in that direction, or it stays fixed, you get a very different kind of bend in your spine. This is the kind of bend that doesn't feel so good. It's not so functional because a lot of weight that's above here is actually falling outside the base of support down here, and it puts a lot of stress on particular muscles, on maybe that part of the spine. So you want to have this gentle sense that the middle of the back begins to move backward just a little bit. Just a little bit. Just a little bit as you do it. Now, for some people, they can simply pay attention to the middle of the back, and that'll be enough. Didn't know I could do that. Didn't know I could pay attention to the middle of my back, and it would just start to move as part of the movement of my head. For other people, that part of the back may not respond just by paying attention. So you might want to touch this part of your rib cage, or place your hands, draw a little ring around yourself, put one hand, if you can, comfortably behind you in the back, one in the front, and as you lower your head, deliberately start to make the movement so that the middle of you rounds backward a little bit. You should feel kind of an expansion in the surface of the skin on the back, and you'll feel this folding happening in the front. That's nice. And you'll notice that when you do it in this more coordinated way, one of the sensations to attune yourself is that the strain in your neck may not be there anymore. Because to lower the head like this, the head is essentially falling forward of the support. The background here really hasn't changed, so the weight of the head is falling forward, and it has to be caught by the muscles there on the back of the neck. But when I distribute the action more evenly throughout my spine and my pelvis, suddenly my neck doesn't feel like it has to work so hard. And that's because the shape more equitably distributes the load. Yeah? The same thing is true if you lift your head. For many people, the rigidity in the spine, or the way that the torso tends to remain kind of fixed, when they lift the head, they make a very isolated movement. Yeah? If you've ever been to Venice, and you've been to some of the cathedrals in Venice, you know that there are certain cathedrals where all of the paintings are on the ceiling. And you'll see people walking around the cathedral, looking, and gradually their neck's getting sorer and sorer. So when you go to the front desk, they'll hand you a mirror. And it's literally a mirror that you hold like this so people can look down into the mirror and see what's on the ceiling without having to do this with their neck. Yeah? But why not develop the functional ability to look up by engaging the whole of yourself to do so? So once again, I'm not having to compress the back of my neck to lift, but I can do something with my pelvis, something with my torso. My abdomen kind of lifts into me a little bit. Yeah? And I develop this image, slowly developing this image for myself of a head that actually moves because of what the background does, the spine being the background, the support for the head, that I don't have to just have a locked spine and just move my head always as if it's only attached from this one little place. The entire spine is meant to respond to the movements of the head. Now, how can we go a little deeper into this idea? Well, just like we did in the first lesson, where we took different emphasis in the movement, we can do the same thing here. So keep your head on the horizon. Keep your eyes fixed on some point on the wall in front of you. And now start to roll your pelvis backward. You'll see how I'm rolling this back. But keep your head fixed on the horizon. And you'll notice that in this little movement of the pelvis, there emerges a kind of extra effort that I have to make in my neck and in my throat and in my back to keep my head on the horizon when my pelvis rolls back. So what happens if, when my pelvis rolls back, I allow the head to bow forward? I start to make this rounding movement in the spine. Well, now I feel like the top and the bottom really have the same idea. I don't feel like I'm fighting against myself. I feel like if I want to look forward, the pelvis could be here, but if I want to look down, the pelvis can be here. If I want to look further down, the pelvis can be here, further up, bub, 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 bub. But by doing this particular thing where I take away the connection, I can actually examine my habit. I can examine the way I tend to move myself in pieces, or I tend to work against myself in certain movements. And then here in the practice, you really can take time to notice what are the sensations that goes with that. Oh, my stomach feels all compressed while my head is trying to stay lifted. But what if I make this more distributed? There is a way to round your back that's functionally integrated, where the top and the bottom really have the same idea. Now you can take this idea and look at it from the other point of view. So round yourself down, let your head slowly lower down with this distributed rounding in the back, and then stay here for a moment. And begin to lift your head and eyes, but nothing else. And notice that without the participation of your spine, without the back changing shape to help lift the head, the way you have to do it is you have to use an extraordinary amount of effort in the back of the neck. It's a very familiar effort. We're all used to being a little disorganized and just lifting our head to look up for long periods of time, sometimes in school. But notice now, if you lower your head again, and this time you make sure that when the head lifts, at the same time, at every moment, the lifting of the head is timed more and more smoothly with the rolling of the pelvis, with the bringing of the spine forward and up. Again, there's no amount that you have to do. There's no distance you're trying to cover that's the proper amount of distance. You're looking to do it in a patient way that allows you to discover a very different sensation for moving the head. You can even explore a third option, which is to lift your head a little higher as you roll your pelvis back. This is quite a distortion in the spine, but it's something that a lot of people actually rehearse in their life. And then you can see what it's like to combine the other direction of the pelvis with the lifting of the head. So now you have at least 3 ways. I can lift my head and do nothing else in my spine. I can lift my head and roll the pelvis forward and arc the middle of my back forward and up. Or I can lift my head and round backwards. By comparing each of the 3 options, I can really sense how those ingredients fit together in ways that are efficient and ways that are really corrosive, actually. And it's clarifying to be able to play with the varieties so that I can really begin to have a kind of a dignity of choice in how I do it. Yeah? Now, take a rest for a moment. And again, just pay attention to the sense of the connection you have with the stool that you're sitting on, or the chair. And also notice when you move your head around, when you lift and lower your head, when you turn it, notice the sensations that you feel down into the rest of your body. And notice if it's more pleasant to actually have the ribs, the pelvis, your hips, actually part of the steering that turns and manipulates your head into different parts of the world. Yeah? And so now we're going to look at a particular piece of this. When most people lower the head, the part of the back that they tend to round tends to be this upper half. It's not everybody, but it's just a generalization that happens to be the case for most people. When they lower the head, this is the kind of rounding that they experience at first. You can see that the lower half of me, down about here, is not really changing its position. You can see the squares on the back of the screen here. That's very different than this. So notice, if you just naively lower your head again, notice the tendency to always initiate the rounding from somewhere quite high up. Yeah? And see if you can gradually move your point of intention. In other words, the apex of the rounding, the point that moves back first. Move that point a little bit further down. Here it was up here. Now I moved it a little further down. What kind of space do you have to imagine? What kind of space can you create in this part of your back to allow this to happen? Now I can move it down just below where my sternum ends. And it's interesting now. I really feel myself actually engaging a little bit in my abdomen rather than just my abdomen falling and quote-unquote relaxing. If I move the point of intention so that now I'm somewhere just below the sternum, I have to do something much more specific with my abdomen than just letting it collapse. If I move it further down, that's nice. Now, part of this idea of changing the levels at which you create the bend is so that, one, you can feel what it's like to distribute the movement more equitably, right? So we're not trying to bend in one particular place. We're trying to distribute the action more evenly. So one of the things you can start to see is that for the movement to become more and more of a distributed curve, you actually want the top and the bottom. Sorry, I'll move this over here. You want the top and the bottom to actually come a little bit forward as the middle is going backward. Now, most of us don't really do this. We just roll the pelvis back, and so we do this. So there's a lot of mass that actually travels back behind the base of support where your pelvis touches the seat. And so there's a big difference between even rounding nicely like this and actually thinking of the bottom and the top coming a little bit forward so that you actually start to have parts of the mass of your body coming a little bit forward as other parts go a little bit backward. So it's not just simply the top dropping in a straight line down to the bottom and having all of that weight out behind the chair, but you can kind of emphasize the pelvis almost like it's being pulled forward underneath you. And again, you want to be careful when you do this. It's easy to have somebody give you instructions and then immediately try your hardest to achieve them. And you really don't need to do that. In fact, try to make an insufficient effort. How about that? So I'll show you the first version where a lot of mass travels backwards. That looks like this. you can see where the stool is, and you can see my back it's curving nicely. It's a little more in the top than in the bottom, but you can see so much of my weight is traveling back over the stool. And that's very different than if I think of arcing my head almost forward. And I also think of my pelvis actually coming, the bottom of it in particular, almost pulling forward under the backs of my legs here. It's not going to be dramatic. But you'll see that the distribution of the weight over the stool is a little different. This is much less familiar for me. The familiar feeling is to sort of fall, to compress, to create the movement or to create a transition. That's what we're all a little more accustomed to. Doing it this other way, where I really try to actually draw my sit bones a little bit forward, and I really try to lengthen and get longer up through my head. This is different. This requires a different order of precision. It requires a different order of patience. And it really requires a different order of compassion. Because when you try to do something that's new, very often the thing you're looking for, the first experience you have is you can't find it. You try to do it and you really feel that you can't. And very often your first response is then to just add a lot of effort to it. And that's not what you need to do. That's why you have a practice, is so you can take the time to sort of craft a different image. Here's a very different beginning from this. And I can really start to actually feel the difference in what I have to do with my legs, because my legs have to actually activate a little bit so that the bottom of the pelvis, when it pulls forward, I actually need some of the tone in the backs of my legs to help me do that. And then I have this sense that the front of the chest here, it just comes, I know I'm rounding, but it feels as if my sternum, especially this uppermost part of my sternum up here, this doesn't really go back behind my pelvis. I have the sense it almost goes forward and up, and then it just drops almost straight down. And I'm making the accommodation for the space in the way that I'm lengthening through the rest of my back. Another good way to play with this is to check the angle of your elbows. If your hands are here on your knees and a lot of weight really goes back, you'll notice your elbows tend to straighten. But if you make this more where the bottom and the top actually arc forward towards each other, the elbows actually, they keep their bend and they just drop straight down as the shape of the spine inside of it changes. And then also on the way back up, the top of the sternum, it just rises. It feels like it almost goes straight up, even though I know there's a lot changing. The way to think about this, again, if we take our trusty roller here, if I make the movement so that a lot of weight goes backwards, here's the top of my sternum. It's very much this feeling of things going backwards. They definitely go down closer to the floor, but primarily the direction is back. It feels like this. It definitely gets closer to the floor, but it's quite a bit further back. When the movement is distributed a little bit more evenly, where you have the bottom and the top actually slowly drawing forward as the middle of the spine goes backward, now my sense of the sternum is that it almost rises up like a wave before it starts to drop down. Yeah. So these are just some of the sensory details that you can play with here. There's one other variation you might want to try, And for those of you that feel like the back is quite stiff and you can't have access to this lower part of your back, or there's some other segment of the spine that feels sort of not very accessible to you, a very, very simple, direct way into creating more space is to just very gradually lower the head. And you lower it to the place you go to easily. Yeah, you go about there. And then you just breathe in and out several times. And each time that you exhale, you'll notice that something, as you exhale, something in the spine yields a little bit. You don't have to make it happen. But each time you exhale, there's this little opportunity that becomes available. Somehow the air pressure is leaving the torso, and things actually soften and become easier to move at that point. And you may feel when you inhale, the air pressure increases, and that kind of tends to lift the head a little bit. But then when you exhale, again, everything kind of softens. And if you just do this 10, 15, 20 times, obviously within your range of comfort, you'll start to see, without using a lot of willpower, that you'll begin to gain access to those parts of the spine that before felt like they were completely stiff, or they were off limits, or it wasn't comfortable to bend it, or you didn't know how to bend it. Also, that way of working gives you time. It creates a kind of a very patient, gradual sequence that you can go through, where it's just the coming and going of the breath that creates the opportunity for the change in the muscle tone of the spine. Yeah? So if you do that a couple of times, you get to the place where you've now begun to just feel like there's more slack in the spine. There's more of your spine that's able to participate in the shape. For the last part of the lesson, you can sort of hang out here in this rounded position, and then slowly begin to lift your head, but make sure that each degree that your head lifts, that you have this sense that it's not being done by the muscles in your neck or your upper back so much, but that somehow you're sourcing the movement. Each time you lift a little bit more, you continue to source the movement throughout the entire shape of your back that's just unfolding. So that the head, the timing of the head, doesn't race ahead of the timing you're developing throughout the rest of your body. And it's an unusual feeling to have the head arrive on the horizon like this with all of this support in place underneath it. Most of us are so used to having our head at the computer screen or reading a book, and we fall. We fall. We're stuck in some rigidified shape. And here in the lesson, you really have the opportunity to kind of reset all of the participation of each of the vertebrae, the pelvis, your legs, your hip joints, and of course your eyes too. Yeah? So take some more time after this, but just as a sort of a closing statement, I want you just to think about what we did on the first day. We were bending to the side. We were folding one side while we were lengthening the other, and we were looking at the difference between compressing to make the movement versus this idea of lengthening out the top of the head. So we're constantly getting longer even as we bend. Yeah? Then we looked at ways of activating the lower part, just activating the upper, and then figuring out ways to time them together. Yeah? And we pretty much took the same approach in the lesson today. We looked at the ways of simply lowering the head and noticing at the beginning what part of ourselves moved and which parts didn't, which parts of the spine seemed to participate and which seemed locked out of the process. And then by gradually testing, trying different sections, putting them together, understanding how the middle has to move equal and opposite to the ends, you start to create a more integrated bending and folding of the spine. So if you have one takeaway, it's that this idea that your spine can actually lengthen even in actions where you're folding yourself. This would be a lovely thing to take away from both days. And tomorrow, we're actually going to put these two together in something slightly more ambitious, still in the same position, still using the same principles, but you'll see something a little more active and dynamic. Okay? So again, I'm Andrew Gibbons. This is the Body of Knowledge course. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you soon.